Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear children, dear people, my name is Max, I'm 29 years old, and I was born and raised in Berlin. I initially studied law there for 2 years, but changed my mind and then studied medicine in Frankfurt, Germany. I currently work as a doctor for the German Army in Hamburg. But who I am doesn't really matter. The reason I'm making this video is because I'm worried about our world and how it's going. We live in a world in which more and more conflicts are turning into wars, in a world in which more people than ever are suffering from hunger, and in which more people than ever are on the run. More and more parts of the world are becoming uninhabitable and are losing the prospect of an area worth living in for all living beings, partly due to climate change and partly as a result of human activity. It is becoming more difficult for each individual to organize their life according to their own ideas and to plan for the future, as it is not certain what this will look like in terms of economic, social, and security prospects. It at least seems as if there's currently a lack of concrete plans for a common, desirable, and peaceful future, and as if the power over this future lies in the hands of individuals whose will and ideas for a fairer world for all people are sometimes barely perceptible or recognizable. Instead of shaping our future together, and as a collective of people, the world and politics are increasingly focusing on the national level and on separating ourselves from one another, instead of developing ideas and solutions for global and collective problems together. But I believe that it is by no means too late to change something. Not just to change something, but to preserve the world together as something wonderful and worth living in. But especially in a globalized world, we will only be able to do this together. We must actively act together, make decisions together, and work together to implement them. Until now, this may not always have seemed necessary or even feasible. And it certainly won't be easy or quick to implement. But we have something that we have not yet had or utilized accordingly. And this is the internet. It's the technical development and thus the possibility of connecting people with each other, no matter where, without delay, and regardless of their historical or cultural background. And I would like to connect with you and all of you in this way and share an idea in the form of this video, initially only in German and in English, of how I believe we can at least try to ensure the long-term survival of humans in harmony with the living beings around us. I would like to avoid categorizations and terms such as left or right, socialism, communism, or capitalism, and the like. I just want to share the idea of how we can possibly initiate a process of positive adaptation or change for all people and maintain or create a world that is peacefully united, safe, and livable as possible. It should also become clear at the end of the video how the participation of all of you is part of this. And it should be said right at the beginning that this is in no way a financial request. The concept and the idea that I would like to present should be based on the well-known principles of equality, freedom, and the rule of law, as well as on solidarity, sustainability, and science. I believe that such an idea and a healthy continuation of our world can only be possible through a democratically legitimized global form of government. Such a global form of government would have various fundamental goals. The most important goal is to secure global peace. Greater global cooperation between all countries and people could reduce conflicts and promote peace, as common interests and solutions to problems could be developed and international tensions could be reduced. It would enable global economic cooperation and thus reduce trade barriers, promote international trade, and support economic growth and stability across national borders. By strengthening international standards for human rights and introducing a general global constitution, people around the world could be better protected against discrimination, oppression, and violence. A democratically legitimized global policy could also help to reduce social and economic inequalities and promote equality and justice by encouraging a fairer distribution of resources and opportunities. Coordinated global healthcare could improve access to medical care, especially in times of crisis, such as pandemics, and strengthen the healthcare infrastructure in poorer countries. It could coordinate effective and innovative measures to combat climate change and promote sustainable development, leading to a healthier environment and a more livable and protected world for future generations. This could effectively tackle the causes of flight and prevent the displacement of people. In addition, the cross-border exchange of knowledge and education could be promoted, which would lead to a more informed population and stimulate innovation and social participation. Political engagement could also be increased through the direct involvement of citizens in decision-making processes at a global level, possibly with the help of artificial intelligence systems, and the sense of belonging and responsibility towards common global challenges could also be strengthened this way. Intercultural dialogue could also be promoted in such a system, which would lead to a better understanding between different cultures and possibly to the reduction of prejudices. Global policies would also favor the exchange of technologies in order to develop common solutions to problems such as energy supply, food security, or environmental protection. In this way, the best possible joint investments could be made in technological development, but also in infrastructure that maximizes livability. It is also important to emphasize that this would provide a secure framework for your own efforts and successes. Overall, such a global policy could therefore help to create a fairer, more peaceful, safer, and more sustainable world in which the needs of all people would be taken into account. It would make it possible to fulfill the basic needs of all people in the world. In other words, psychological needs such as food, water, shelter, clothing, and medical care, security needs in terms of physical and psychological safety and protection from violence and discrimination, social needs in terms of belonging to communities, social interactions, friendships, and family ties, esteem in terms of being recognized and respected by others, as well as sense of self-worth and identity. And also self-realization in the sense of the opportunity for personal development, education, creativity, and the pursuit of individual interests. Cultural and individual differences must be taken into account, but a protected framework must be created for this. As an introduction to the basic prerequisites and framework conditions for the launch of such a democratically legitimized system of government, there are various important topics and areas that I would like to briefly mention. In principle, existing international institutions such as the United Nations could and should be integrated and strengthened. Initially, platforms for citizen participation would have to be created where citizens worldwide could express their opinions and proposals on global issues and where referendums and votes could take place. In particular, digital technologies such as e-governance and blockchain technologies should be used to create transparent and accessible functioning systems, including for possible elections. Global education campaigns would need to be initiated to increase people's awareness and engagement and enable informed discussions. Cultural sensitivity should again be taken into account, and intercultural dialogue should take place in order to identify common values and goals. Local needs and circumstances would need to be taken into account, yet cooperation between states would need to be encouraged, also to protect the global rule of law and human rights. This should take place within the framework of participatory decision-making and with the involvement of existing governments, civil society, and companies. These points merely provide a rough framework for international cooperation and already exist in a similar form. Now I would like to try to describe as concretely as possible, but not in detail, an idea of which steps have to be implemented in a process in order to initiate a global government over time. In other words, what global framework would have to be set in order to make a world government functional and realistic as a global state system for all people. In the future, global elections would have to be held to elect a democratically legitimized institution. Here, defined constituencies would elect temporary members to a global parliament. Some of the members of parliament could possibly also be elected by lot in order to make the parliament even more representative and to allow a wide range of voices and perspectives to be heard. A world state, in the sense of a federalist system with individual constituencies, would be constructed parallel to the continued existence of individual countries and cultures. However, unlike the United Nations, it would be directly elected by the people and be endowed with more competences. General decisions could be made globally binding for all people, and universally valid basic rights could be created, followed by the corresponding judiciary, that is, adjudicating bodies, and executive, that is, executive enforcing bodies and institutions. A House of Representatives would have to be established in factual and also digital form, with assemblies of representatives to identify and collate issues and problems with the aim of finding appropriate solutions in the interest of fairer distribution. Very clear framework conditions would have to be created here for a system that works in the long term. A key point would be the introduction and integration of a standardized passport system that would confer global citizen status. This passport would include a digital component to enable billing, salaries, finances, and other data storage and utilization over time. In the long term, a standardized tax and financial system is also essential, to which an internationally standardized, initially digital currency is linked, which should be seamlessly compatible with existing national currencies and payment systems, but should enable efficiency, security, and accessibility. I have further concretized these points in a written concept paper, among other things, which is also referred to below. There would also need to be an upper and lower limit for income, earnings, and assets. This is probably the most critical, but also one of the most important points, and an explanation, discussion, and definition will follow. I would like to ask you to wait for this section. A common language that is learned from an early age in addition to one's own national or cultural language could also be socially introduced over time and would greatly facilitate communication across borders. Furthermore, we should establish a transparent co-determination process for all citizens. The inclusion of modern technologies, including AI again, will help us to make major decisions democratically, sensibly, and based on science. In this sense, we would create a common constitution and a common basic law. Another aspect also with regard to global peacekeeping is an international executive with an international military, or rather a kind of a world police force to monitor and enforce rights and laws and to maintain global peace. It would act as a central supranational organization in cooperation with the regional units and would preferably be deployed in cases of cross-border crime and for conflict management. In addition, a global judicial system with the Supreme Court would be created, whereby clear attention would have to be paid to legal protection, and this would have to be protected against abuse of power with corresponding framework conditions and control bodies. There should be clear review bodies to protect against the law. In addition, transparent access to information, in particular to regulations, must be guaranteed worldwide. This also includes worldwide access to the internet, which would have to be established gradually and subsidized by common funds, of course, with the proviso that this is also desired. We need to establish global standards. That means minimum standards for the fulfillment of basic needs. For example, access to clean water and education. Existing programs could take effect here, which could be strengthened through greater international investment in these areas. Programs and international agreements to support agriculture in developing countries should also be expanded and developed with the aim of achieving a more targeted and fairer distribution of yields, particularly in regions with high food insecurity. This should include financial support for the development of technologies and educational programs. Policies should aim to strengthen local markets and promote trade within countries and regions to increase economic self-reliance, while also aiming to establish open trade borders and internationally free markets and cooperation. Sustainable development and the promotion of sustainable development goals already exist in the form of the United Nations 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which are already being addressed in many projects and should therefore also be integrated into this concept. It would also be important to develop indicators to measure well-being and satisfaction within countries and different cultures, and to respond to them politically. In a global state system, the possibility of freedom of religion and belief should of course be made possible, as long as no other people are harmed in this progress. In a global state system, the possibility of freedom of religion and belief should of course be made possible, as long as no other people are harmed in this process. That means people live within the framework and protection of the law and live out their own faith without harming others. Ensuring this would require precise constitutional principles with protection of religious freedom, a separation of church and state to maintain neutrality, anti-discrimination laws, interreligious education and dialogue, protection and free practice of religious holidays, and protection and space for sites of religious practice. Religions and faith are such an important part of people and give many people strength, support, and community. The free practice of religion, whether it is Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, Judaism, Christianity, Confucianism, Taoism, or any other religion or faith, is completely irrelevant. The main thing is that we do not restrict anyone and allow others to live their faith with the aim of peaceful tolerance, including a wide variety of places of worship and communal neighborhoods. Furthermore, we need social safety nets worldwide and clear support from the community for population groups in need, for example through a conditional basic income and global social assistance. This would be guided by clear controls and, if necessary, punishment of the principle that people who are able to work must work or be socially active, or otherwise receive no support in the form of social or financial aid from the state or society. Education initiatives would ensure access to high-quality education for all age groups and could also be made available to people across the board through education programs and digital solutions. Providing healthcare and guaranteeing access to basic healthcare services for all people would also become the mission and duty of a global government. In my own experience, access to hygiene and materials is often decisive for healthcare. Sustainable resource distribution and management with the promotion of sustainable practices and targeted transport and supply routes to ensure access to medicines or consumables at prices that are initially adapted to the region and then standardized in the long term, particularly in the area of healthcare products, would make this possible. With the help of far-reaching investments in healthcare systems and science, as opposed to investments in the defense industry, the necessary healthcare could also be ensured for future generations and worldwide, within preventive, health-preserving, enlightened living conditions. The protection of our environment should also be an integral part of this global initiative. We would have to implement globally standardized regulations on environmental protection and promote renewable energies. In doing so, we would have to ensure the protection of living creatures and habitats in terms of the expansion of marine protected areas and nature reserves. Science clearly shows a rapid recovery and massive benefits for us and our environment, and the protection of biodiversity could also be practically realized through protected areas. A wide range of projects involving plastic-eating enzymes to reduce waste, various water processing systems, monitoring systems to regulate fishing, or projects to restore seagrass meadows or coral reefs would also be promoted and applied worldwide. A fairer distribution of resources and food supply could also make such regulations possible for countries that had previously voted against such regulations. In the future, quite drastic ideas such as an upper limit for individual meat consumption or an obligation to separate waste and recycle could also be discussed. In combination with innovative solutions to reduce global warming, these actions could mitigate the consequences and effects of climate change. Over time, large investments could then be made in transport and infrastructure, and possibly certain civic facilities and companies could be nationalized, thus enabling free access to public transport and state services such as museums, swimming pools, public barbecue facilities, sport grounds, and so on, with a market that is otherwise as free as possible. This should also include the possibility to make your own proposals for your own initiatives on online platforms with feedback and discussion options, and evaluation and voting functions. Here it is repeatedly important that clear feedback systems are integrated. Regular feedback on and specific responses to community needs and satisfaction could take place. Adaptability is crucial here. Political measures must be flexible enough to be able to react to new findings or changes in social conditions. Monitoring committees should be set up to monitor the implementation of measures. Most of this will probably sound very idealistic and unrealizable, or like a lot of state control. But I believe that if we people pull together and at least maintain the hope and the will for a good and free world in the future, and take active steps towards this, it will also be possible. A crucial point, and probably one of the greatest challenges, is the fairer global distribution of money, goods and resources, with the aim of improving the living conditions of almost all people worldwide. An upper and lower limit for personal wealth, income and earnings is probably indispensable here. It is a very complex issue and rightly controversial. It is probably the biggest sticking point, but it is of essential importance. The aim is to fulfill the basic needs of all people while still keeping individual needs, work, merit, happiness, and aspirations sufficiently attractive, rewarding, and encouraging them. And this is possible and is also supported by the few people who would not benefit directly from it, as has been shown if the corresponding goal and the corresponding sense are present. A recent petition from Davos, signed by 370 millionaires and billionaires, shows that these people are calling for more taxes for themselves in the interests of fairer distribution. There are various studies that show that over 70% of the super rich generally support an additional tax. The current situation is that people with assets of more than $1 million pay less tax than the middle class in the most countries as a percentage of their taxable income. The number of billionaires is also increasing globally, and at the same time, despite many improvements, the number of people suffering from hunger worldwide is stagnating or even growing. However, if it would actually help society, the majority of people would be prepared to redistribute some of their wealth and here I mean only less than 1% of the people, but only if it would really help, affect everyone, and make a difference. And these goals, this concept, and its implementation would only work globally. Otherwise, there will be an emigration from the countries that would try to implement something like this politically. And this is where a globally standardized regulation can enable practical fairness. Company management and investment opportunities could be distributed among several people. Economic, social, and ethical considerations are required to realize this. I will come to a specific proposal in a moment. Regional differences would have to be taken into account for an upper and lower limit for income and wealth. Different living costs, economic conditions, and cultural and climatic factors, which currently vary considerably, must be taken into account here. On the one hand, the limits could initially be adjusted on the basics of local averages and the cost of living. On the other hand, border areas could be defined that roughly cover and include all regional differences. In the long term, the aforementioned standardized passport, tax, financial, and currency system could minimize these differences, which would mean even greater fairness. The implementation and enforcement is of course a major challenge, but it is feasible. There would have to be a broad international cooperation in the interests of global governance linked to international agreements and joint legislation that is democratically legitimized, at least with a 2 of 3 majority. In this area, a 90% rule should apply. Mechanisms would have to be developed to monitor and enforce compliance with these limits, including transparent reporting on income, assets, and ownership, which could be made possible as part of a digital passport system. There is, of course, a clear tension between the natural desire to individual freedom, for example, the freedom to earn as much as possible in a free market, and the pursuit of social justice, for example, the reduction of extreme inequality. There must therefore be a corresponding incentive structure, and it must be ensured that such limits on income and assets, so ownership, do not undermine the motivation to innovate or to be entrepreneurial. I would therefore now like to offer specific possible figures, which are of course, as everything here, open to discussion. To be specific, an upper income limit could roughly be 10 to 20 times the average income of a country. In the richer countries, this would be 200,000 to 500,000 US dollar per year. Initially, I think a simple upper limit of 500,000 US dollar per person in annual net income makes sense. A lower limit for income, for example, a global minimum wage threshold, could, for example, initially be $2 per hour from a global perspective. According to various reports, this is considered a living wage in globally poorer countries. This would initially mean $4,320 per year, which could possibly also be used as a benchmark for social benefits. In the long term, net hourly earnings of $12 could be targeted globally, which would mean 23,520 per year with a 40-hour week, 5-day week, and 25 days of annual leave. Of course, these are only rough estimates, which people who have a better understanding of economics than I do should discuss and constantly adapt. A lower limit for assets can be realistic and does not necessarily have to be introduced initially, but should also be introduced in the form of a conditional basic income, especially for people who are not able to work. A major essential point is now the upper limit for assets. This could be 10 to 100 million US dollars, for example, which various economic researchers consider to be realistic. In my opinion, the initial limit could be set at 100 million US dollars. This figure would currently affect around 0.025% of the world's population. 0.025. The Global Wealth Report 2021, a report by Credit Suisse, shows that total global wealth is around 418 trillion US. According to the study, an estimated 56 million people, currently closer to 58 million, have assets of over 1 million US. Of these, around 2 million people in the global population each own more than 100 million US, which is just this 0.025%. If it can be assumed that each of these has an average wealth of 150 million US and a wealth cap for 100 million US were to be introduced, we would theoretically have a total surplus of 100 trillion US, which is more than 4 times the GDP of the USA and a quarter of the wealth of the entire world. Theoretically, this money could probably be largely invested in infrastructure, education, researches, and progress. But now back to the question of how individual endeavors can remain attractive enough in the event of fairer distribution, especially with the aforementioned upper limits for income and wealth by a global government. In addition to the rather broadly interpreted upper limits, individual endeavors and entrepreneurial action should be actively encouraged by creating incentives and framework conditions, including for a free market, which support personal initiative and creativity. Incentive systems and rewards are needed here, for example in the form of tax concessions and financial bonuses for taking on social responsibility, that means executive and management, but also for investments, particularly in sustainable areas or disadvantaged regions. Entrepreneurship should also create access to capital, in the sense of providing microloans or support programs for entrepreneurs, including in developing countries, in order to support local business ideas and promote education and training programs. In general, people should be supported in their freedom to make their own economic decisions and use their talents in areas that suit them the best, but any work that is required should also be recognized, supported, and rewarded accordingly. It is important to mention once again that high limits are set for individual income and wealth, so that individual activities, creativity, and dedication to work remain attractive and are reflected in corresponding financial opportunities and social status. In our construct, however, we would have the opportunity to do this in a prospectively secure and livable world. Business models should be supported that are both profitable and sustainable. The use of resources should be transparent and open so that impacts on local and global communities can be analyzed and integrated into new decisions. There should be cultural appreciation of achievements and individual successes in order to further strengthen the courage for self-realization. Through these approaches, a global government could fundamentally ensure that individual aspirations are not only preserved but also encouraged. This would help to strike a healthy balance between individual ambitions and the larger goal of collective justice and a fairer global distribution of resources and thus overall well-being. I realize that the concept has not gone into much detail so far and has not been formulated in concrete terms. However, this is not yet the case, but should be worked out collectively and in the individual areas by experts. However, concrete plans and methods already exist for most of the problems, which can and should be integrated into this overall concept as it progresses. Now, of course, the question arises as to whether such an idea is even remotely feasible. And here the science is quite clear. Although the idea of a global government is extremely challenging and very complex, it has been described many times in history and is theoretically absolutely feasible given the resources available in our world. Success depends on the ability to gain broad agreement, respect cultural differences, and build effective structures. It will take a lot of patience, diplomacy, and possibly several generations of effort to realize such a vision. However, the Internet, and artificial intelligence in particular, can be of great help to us in the context of the right and regulated use to organize democratic processes on a large scale and also to incorporate collected scientific expertise into decision-making by means of appropriate algorithms. The process towards a more global policy is already taking place through various steps in terms of international cooperation and in the United Nations and, if successful, and further disseminated and discussed by the people, and not just the countries, it could ultimately strengthen confidence in a possible further global form of government. My initial idea is to create a website to connect people. In this sense, I would like to ask whether you could imagine living in such a world. Without any obligation, I would like to try to collect encouragement and a mere form of will for such an idea of a global policy via this website. This website will be uploaded at the same time as this video and is intended to provide information, offer opportunities for discussion in the future, but initially just the opportunity to express interest in such a united humanity, with giving your first name, surname, and city of residence. The name of the page is www.acommonidea.com. On this page, and here too, I would like to present a rough schedule, a kind of roadmap, of these steps that would or could be taken towards such a possibly fairer and more beautiful world. That means real steps towards implementation and dissemination. Step 1 to 6 involved researching the literature and working on the concept, then consulting with different people, and then planning and shooting the videos and creating the website. Step 7 is then the release date. Publication of the videos at a fixed date and time by participants. Simultaneous activation of the website. Step 8 is waiting for feedback and reactions, and hoping for as many registrations as possible on the site. Then a live video appearance for reaction not immediately following publication. And the inclusion of discussion options for questions on the website and in public spaces. Step 9 is the dissemination in as many ways as possible, so the translation into as many languages as possible and sharing within other countries, making it accessible to as many people as possible, and the adaptation and improvement of the website. Step 10 is meetings of party political and institutional political functionaries. The collection of ideas from people via the website, which must be continuously adapted and improved. The collection of proposals and ideas for a general fundamental constitution and a basic law encompassing all people. Here also the establishment of committees and bodies of people who collect, and vote on ideas and integrate them into the constitutional idea. Step 12 is the creation of the first drafts of a constitution and a basic law for all people in every available language, initially without any obligations, and voting functions via the internet, at least 2 or 3 majority for each proposal. Step 13 is the reflections on the development of institutions and the absolute integration and utilization and strengthening of existing institutions, the integration of the idea into the political and party systems of the individual states, and the possible formation of new parties and further creation and integration of new bodies and committees of people who collect and collate ideas. Step 14, if applicable, founding of a United Humanity Party in as many countries in the world as possible. In the worst case scenario, the mere existence of these parties will change the national debate and perhaps influence politics. In the best case scenario, Once a party enters parliament somewhere, it will strengthen the credibility of all its sister parties and trigger a kind of snowball effect that will eventually lead to most democratic nations adopting a constitution that is at least similar in its goals. Step by step, all people who wish to do so could be integrated. Step 15 would be the publication of the first ratified version of the Constitution and Basic Law defining the formation and function of the proposed new systems of global, social, political, and economic governance, conducting experiments and stimulations to test and trial rules and regulations and potential strategies for deploying these new social, economic, and political ideas would be the next step. First application of global rules and start of the creation of a global standard and the preparation of a protocol for the regular evaluation and, if necessary, updating and republication of the Constitution and laws. Step 16 would be the implementation of the whole in the forms of state and government and parties of the individual countries. Nevertheless, the continued existence of these. Foundation of a union or continuation within the existing United Nations or United Humans. And then setting the rules and constitution and laws and the obligation of individual countries and people to do so. And the domestic policy based on the General Constitution of the United Nations. Step 17, and this is the last step, would be the further establishment, staffing, and development of the individual institutions, parliaments, chambers, committees, courts, and executive bodies. Application and enforcement of rights and laws globally, with the redistribution of wealth, utilization of resources, improving the infrastructure, creating global peace, enforcement and maintenance of peace, and permanent adjustment, optimization, and feedback function. I hope that this idea and the explanations have found an appropriate framework and that this has not dragged on too much. In view of the rather gloomy scientific and development policy forecasts for the times that lie ahead of all of us, with regard to the massive increase in causes of flight, and thus people fleeing and living without any basis for life, with regard to new pandemics and natural disasters, but nevertheless, actually such a promising scientific, technological, and socially possible beautiful future, I hope that as many of you as possible will be able to do something with this plan or this idea, at least to some extent. And hopefully take the small step at the beginning and simply express and share their pure interest in a peaceful future that is worth living for everyone. Perhaps we can use this as an impetus for a joint collective development process from which I believe each and every one of us would benefit. You can register on the site with your name and city of residence, and I hope that with your support, more functions will soon be added, and that this, in small steps, could have an impact on world politics. The most important thing now is to allow everyone to participate, which is where the next step is to translate the concept into all possible languages and spread it to every place in the world, no matter how small. I look forward to everyone contacting me and above all, each other, and contributing their ideas. Let us try together to take our future into our own hands and try to keep this world a wonderful place to live in and make life better for so many. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to your feedback and I wish all of you all the best.